Across the shifting landscape of global politics, a profound transformation is unfolding, one that was once dismissed as impossible, improbable, or simply too distant to matter. But today, that change is undeniable. Africa, long described by external powers through the lenses of dependency, conflict, and desperation, has begun rewriting its own story. Not quietly, not slowly, but through bold strategic moves that now command the world's attention. Africa has redefined global power, and for the first time in centuries, the West can no longer shape the continent's future on its own terms. This is not the story of a single country or a single leader. It is the story of a continent reclaiming agency, asserting sovereignty, and emerging as a central actor in a multipolar world. From economic alliances and technology hubs to resource nationalism and currency independence, Africa is constructing a new architecture of power, one that challenges the old global order and compels the world's strongest nations to recalibrate their expectations. For decades, the narrative surrounding Africa was dominated by the same questions. How much aid would it receive? Which powers controlled its resources? And how long would it remain dependent? But the world that once asked those questions is gone. Today, Africa is asking its own questions and providing its own answers. This shift did not happen overnight. It emerged in phases, built through a series of quiet but profound decisions made by governments across the continent. Decisions to nationalize mineral assets, renegotiate foreign contracts, rewrite trade policies, reject external pressure, and strengthen regional alliances. What once seemed fragmented has begun to converge into a coherent continental movement. A turning point came when African nations began speaking in one voice within global energy markets. With the world racing toward renewable technologies, Africa, home to over 40% of the planet's rare earth minerals, cobalt, manganese, graphite, and lithium, suddenly possessed leverage it had never exercised before. Western industries, especially in the United States and Europe, had long relied on cheap and unrestricted access to these critical inputs. But Africa's new policies shifted the balance. Export restrictions were introduced, value addition requirements were mandated, and global corporations found themselves facing a new reality. Raw materials would no longer leave Africa unprocessed. Instead, batteries, solar panels, electric vehicles, and high-tech components were to be manufactured on African soil. The message was clear. Africa would no longer be the world's mine. It would be a factory, a competitor, and a partner, not a supplier to be exploited. As this economic awakening took shape, African governments expanded their cooperation with emerging powers. New trade corridors formed linking East Africa to India, Central Africa to China, and Southern Africa to the Middle East. Infrastructure agreements focused not on extraction, but on industrialization. Technology exchanges replaced the outdated donor-benefactor structure of previous eras. For the first time in modern history, Africa's economic destiny was guided by negotiation, not imposition. Diplomatically, the continent sharpened its influence as well. The African Union gained stronger representation on the global stage, pressing for permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council and demanding reforms in global financial institutions. The notion that Africa should only be consulted rather than directly involved was no longer acceptable. With a population surpassing 1.4 billion, larger than Europe and the Americas combined, Africa's demographic weight became impossible to ignore. The emergence of regional military partnerships further altered the strategic landscape. Multinational defense agreements, coordinated security alliances, and the expulsion of long-standing foreign military bases demonstrated a shift toward autonomy. Western nations that had operated for decades with little accountability suddenly found their influence fading. New partnerships emerged with Russia, China, Turkey, and Middle Eastern states, reshaping the continent's security architecture. Energy independence also served as a catalyst. Countries such as Nigeria, Angola, and Mozambique expanded their role in global gas markets. Meanwhile, Kenya, Egypt, Morocco, South Africa, and Ethiopia positioned themselves as renewable energy hubs, producing surplus electricity for export. Africa's ability to leverage its solar, geothermal, and wind resources placed it at the forefront of the green energy transition. While Africa's rise was gaining momentum internally, the external environment accelerated the shift even faster. Financial instability in the West, mounting debt crises, banking failures, and geopolitical tensions weakened the leverage Western nations once held. As traditional powers became consumed by internal challenges, Africa filled the vacuum, forming new alliances, renegotiating contracts, and demanding partnership rather than patronage. Perhaps the most significant indicator of Africa's transformation is the changing trajectory of its youth. No longer waiting for salvation from distant capitals, a new generation of innovators, engineers, scientists, entrepreneurs, and policymakers emerged within Africa itself. Tech hubs in Kigali, Nairobi, Accra, Lagos, and Cairo became launching pads for solutions to African challenges, from digital payments and drones to artificial intelligence and renewable grids. For the first time, African cities became global destinations for talent, not just sources of migration. The West, observing this shift, attempted to maintain influence through sanctions, pressure campaigns, and diplomatic conditioning. But these familiar tools failed. Sanctions that once crippled governments now pushed them toward Eastern partnerships. Trade threats accelerated African industrialization instead of stopping it. Attempts to control resource policy were met with legal reforms asserting ownership. The landscape had changed, and the old mechanisms of dominance no longer worked. Africa's decision to strengthen intercontinental trade sealed the transformation. The African Continental Free Trade Area, one of the largest economic blocs in the world, began reducing barriers and creating unified markets. Goods moved faster. Currencies stabilized through regional agreements. Manufacturing clusters multiplied. Africa, once divided by borders drawn by colonial powers, began integrating its economies from within. As global supply chains shifted, the world discovered that Africa was no longer peripheral. It was central. The cobalt needed to power electric cars. The manganese used in steel. The gold stabilizing global currencies. The gas that fueled new industries. The solar fields that powered energy transitions. All of it flowed through Africa's new strategic vision. This redefinition of global power was not merely economic or political. It was psychological. Africa no longer viewed itself through the stories written by others. It wrote its own story, defined its own priorities, and forged its own alliances. The West, accustomed to shaping African policy, now found itself negotiating instead of instructing. This new era carries profound implications. For the first time since the industrial age, Africa stands not as a follower, but as a leader in several critical domains. Technology, energy, resources, demographics, and geopolitics have converged to give the continent a central role in determining the future of the global order. The question is no longer whether Africa will rise. It has risen. The question is how the world will adapt to this new reality, one in which Africa speaks with its own voice, acts on its own terms, and shapes global policy with confidence, strategy, and unity. Africa has redefined global power, and the West, facing a continent no longer controlled by external pressure, must now learn to engage with a new Africa, an Africa that negotiates, leads, and decides its own future. In the decades to come, historians may look back and conclude that this was the moment everything changed, the moment Africa moved from the margin to the center, the moment sovereignty replaced dependency, the moment strategy replaced silence, the moment Africa stood not as a subject of global politics, but as a maker of it. The era of a passive Africa is over. A new chapter has begun, one driven by ambition, unity, innovation, and power. Africa has rewritten its place in the world, and the world must now rewrite its place around Africa.